The call came in at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the security panel the moment I heard it. Not because I was being careful, not because I was trained to document things like that. I looked because something about the sound made me feel like I needed to anchor myself to something real. It was a single tone. Soft. Almost polite. The kind of sound an old intercom makes when someone presses a button on the other end and waits. I had been working the night shift at Mercer Valley General for 11 days. 11 nights, technically. I was the new guy. Everyone made sure I knew that. The job wasn't complicated. Walk the halls every 2 hours, check the doors, watch the monitors, answer the desk phone if it rang, which it almost never did after midnight. Sign your name in the logbook and try not to fall asleep in the chair. That was it. That was the whole job.
I had taken it because I needed the money, and because I told myself I wasn't afraid of being alone at night. A lot of people say that. I'm not sure how many of them have actually tested it. The security desk sat at the end of the main ground floor corridor, just past the east entrance. There were 8 monitors in front of me, each one cycling through different camera feeds every 30 seconds. Loading bay, parking lot, main lobby, ICU hallway, stairwell A, stairwell B, the east and west corridors on floors 2 through 6. And then a 9th monitor, off to the side, slightly smaller than the others, with a piece of masking tape across the bottom edge. Written on it in faded black marker, "Do not adjust. Camera malfunction. Floor 7. Awaiting maintenance." I had asked about it on my 3rd night. The guard I was overlapping with, a man named Gerald who had worked there for 9 years and who said maybe 4 sentences to me total over the course of 2 weeks, he looked at the monitor, then looked at me and said, "Floor 7's been sealed off. Has been for a long time. Don't worry about it." And that was the end of the conversation. The monitor for floor 7 showed nothing. Not darkness, exactly. More like static that had forgotten how to move. A gray, formless image that occasionally seemed to shift without actually changing. I had looked at it a few times in those first 11 days, the way you look at something you're not supposed to look at. It never showed anything. It was just there. Background noise in a visual form. So when the intercom tone sounded at 2:47 a.m., I looked at my panel and I saw the light lit up next to a call code I had never seen activate before. 7 East.
I stared at it for a moment. The panel had labels for every call station in the building. I had memorized most of them without trying. Room numbers, nurse stations, stairwell intercoms. But 7 East wasn't a room number I recognized, because as far as I understood, Floor 7 didn't have rooms anymore. Floor 7 didn't have anything anymore. It was sealed. The elevator didn't go there. The stairwell door on that landing was supposed to be padlocked from the outside. I pressed the response button. "Security desk?" I said. Nothing. Not silence. There's a difference between silence and nothing. And I know that now in a way I didn't before that night. Silence has texture. Silence has the ambient sound of a building breathing. What came through that intercom was the other thing.
It was the sound of a space that had been closed off from the rest of the world for so long that it had stopped participating in time altogether. I waited maybe 10 seconds, released the button. The light went off. I sat there for a minute, maybe longer.
I told myself it was a malfunction. Old buildings do that. Wiring deteriorates. Call buttons stick and cycle randomly. There was probably a perfectly boring explanation that any electrician could have given me in 30 seconds. I wrote it in the logbook. 2:47 a.m. Intercom activation 7 East. No response. Possible wiring fault. Monitoring. I underlined the word monitoring like that meant something. Then I went back to watching the camera feeds cycle through on the main monitors, and I tried to pay attention to the gray nothing on the ninth screen. And I told myself I had already forgotten about it. I hadn't. At 3:14 a.m., it happened again. Same tone, same light. 7 East. This time I waited before I responded. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe? Or maybe some part of me needed a few extra seconds before I committed to hearing whatever was on the other end. I pressed the button. Security? Hello? There was something this time. I want to be careful about how I describe it because I've replayed it in my head so many times that I'm not fully sure anymore where the memory ends and the anxiety begins. But what I heard, what I believe I heard, was breathing. Not dramatic breathing, not movie breathing.
Just the faint, barely there rhythm of someone being very still and breathing very quietly, the way people breathe when they're trying not to be heard. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then the line went dead. I stood up from the chair. I don't remember deciding to do that. I was just suddenly standing, looking at the panel, feeling the way the air in the security room seemed thicker than it had a moment ago. The fluorescent light above me hummed at a frequency I had never consciously noticed before. Outside, rain had started at some point in the last hour, and I could hear it against the narrow window above the supply cabinet. A soft, continuous sound that, under normal circumstances, I would have found calming. It did not feel calming. I walked to the end of the ground floor corridor and stood at the base of stairwell A. The door was propped open the way it always was at night for ventilation. I looked up through the gap between the railings. 6 floors of concrete and metal and fluorescent light, and then above that, a door I had never opened and never planned to open. I stood there for about 30 seconds. I didn't hear anything. I went back to the desk. At 3:41 a.m., the 9th monitor changed. Not dramatically. Nothing moved across the screen. Nothing appeared. But the quality of the image shifted. The formless gray static sharpened slightly, the way an out-of-focus photograph sharpens when you tilt it toward the light. And in that slightly sharper image, I could make out something I was fairly certain had not been visible before. A hallway. Not clearly. Not with any detail that would have meant anything to anyone else. Just the suggestion of a corridor. A long, straight line of something lighter against something darker. And on one side, what looked like it might have been a wall. Or a row of doors. I couldn't tell. The image quality was too poor. But it was more than the nothing that had been there for 11 days, and my eyes went to it immediately and stayed there in a way that I couldn't fully control. I wrote in the logbook, 0341. Monitor 9 image quality appeared to shift. Still no clear feed. Monitoring. I was doing a lot of monitoring. The intercom was quiet for almost an hour after that. I did my 4 a.m. walkthrough. Every corridor on every accessible floor. Checking door locks, checking stairwells, walking the route I had walked every 2 hours for 11 nights. The hospital at 4 a.m. has a particular kind of stillness that you either make peace with or you don't. Patients sleeping behind closed doors. Night nurses moving quietly at their stations with the careful efficiency of people who have learned not to disturb the dark. The smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath that, older, harder to name. I made it to the 6th floor. At the end of the east corridor, there was a door marked Stairwell A, authorized access only. Past that door, one more flight of stairs. At the top of those stairs, the padlocked door to floor 7. I don't know how long I stood in front of that stairwell door. Long enough that one of the nurses at the 6th floor station, a woman I had nodded to every night without ever learning her name, looked up from her charting and watched me for a moment before looking back down. I kept walking. I was back at the desk by 4:20 a.m. I sat down.
I looked at the monitors. The 9th one had gone back to formless gray. Or maybe I had just convinced myself the earlier shift in the image had been nothing. I was tired. I had been awake since 3 in the afternoon the previous day. Tiredness does things to perception. That's real. That's documented. That's something I told myself over and over in the weeks that followed. At 4:44 a.m., the intercom activated again. 7 East. I answered immediately this time. Hello. And a voice said, "Can someone come up?" I have thought about these 4 words more times than I can count.
The voice was flat, unhurried. Not panicked, not distressed, not whispering or shouting or doing anything that would have made it easier to categorize as clearly wrong. It was the voice of someone who had been waiting a long time for something very ordinary and was simply asking, with great patience, for it to happen. I didn't respond for what felt like a very long time. I said, "Who is this?" The line was already dead.
I called the on-call hospital administrator. I know I did because it's in the logbook. 4:45. Contacted admin on-call re 7 East intercom activity. What I don't fully remember is what I said, or what they said, or the exact texture of that conversation. What I remember is being told to wait, and that someone would follow up in the morning, and that the intercoms in the building had been having issues, and that floor 7 had been decommissioned for renovation years ago, and there was no one up there. No one up there.
I sat at that desk until 6 a.m. when my shift ended. I watched the monitors cycle. I watched the 9th screen show nothing. I listened to the rain slow and eventually stop sometime around 5 in the morning. To the silence that replaced it. It was the most complete silence I had heard all night. The intercom did not activate again. When Gerald came in for the morning overlap, I told him what had happened. I showed him the logbook entries. He read them slowly, the way he did everything. And then he set the logbook back down on the desk. "Did you go up?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded. "Just once." "Good," he said. I asked him if it had happened before. He took his jacket off and hung it on the hook behind the door. Sat down in the chair and looked at the monitors for a moment before he answered. "Once in a while," he said. "Building's old. Wiring's old." "What did the voice say?" I asked. He looked at me then. Actually looked at me, which was more than he had done in 11 days. "What voice?" he said. I left the building at 6:15. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while. Not because I was gathering my thoughts or trying to calm down, but because I genuinely did not feel ready to re-enter the world where it was becoming daylight and people were making coffee and the particular rules of ordinary life applied. I felt like there was a membrane between that world and the one I had been sitting inside all night, and I wasn't sure how to pass through it without carrying something with me. I went back 2 more nights. I don't know why. Maybe because I kept expecting something to resolve, for there to be an explanation waiting for me on the other side of the weekend? A maintenance report, or an electrical assessment, or a note in the logbook from Gerald or someone else who could confirm what I had heard and wrap it in language that made sense. There was nothing like that. On my second night back, I asked the 6th floor nurse, the one who had watched me stand at the stairwell door, how long floor 7 had been sealed. She thought about it. She said she had been working there for 6 years, and it had been sealed the whole time she'd worked there. She said she had heard it was a water damage issue, some kind of flooding in a pipe system that made the floor structurally unsound. I asked if she had ever heard anything from up there. Noises, the intercom, anything. She looked at me with the kind of careful, measured expression that people use when they're deciding how honest to be. "We don't talk about the 7th floor," she said. "Not unkindly, not dramatically. Just as a fact. The way you'd tell someone where the break room was or what time the pharmacy opened." I quit 3 days after that. I told myself it was because a better opportunity had come along, which was partially true. The real reason
the one I've spent a long time being honest with myself about, is that I could not sit in front of those monitors for another night, knowing that the 9th screen was there, and that somewhere above the ceiling of the 6th floor, there was a hallway with a call station that still worked, and that someone, or something, had used it.
I've thought a lot about what the voice said. Can someone come up? Not help me. Not something's wrong. Just that. A request. Patient. Quiet. Like whoever made it had been making it for a very long time and had learned not to expect much. I don't know what was on the 7th floor. I don't know if the intercom was malfunctioning. I don't know if exhaustion was distorting what I heard, or if the image on that 9th monitor actually changed, or if I was simply a new person in a dark building who hadn't yet learned all the ways an old structure can make you feel like you're not alone. What I know is this. I've worked other night jobs since then. Other buildings, other long hours in the dark with only monitors for company. And I've never fully shaken the habit of looking at every intercom panel when I sit down, checking which stations are active, which ones are labeled with old tape and faded marker, which floors aren't on the map anymore. And I always make sure I know, before I answer, exactly where the call is coming from. Because the one thing I keep coming back to, the one thing I haven't been able to set down in all the years since that night, is not the voice. It's the question underneath the voice. If no one is supposed to be on that floor, who had been waiting long enough to ask? And if this story unsettled you, there are more waiting in the dark. Subscribe to Molodix and don't answer the next call alone.